All right, folks. Just getting started here. Going to pull up my PowerPoint for today. Okay, sorry. Yes. All right, this is where we left off. Yeah, so we're a bit behind here, so I'm gonna have to push ahead pretty quickly today and keep us really on track and get through a lot of the material here. I am kind of going through and kind of leading us through the Republic in quite a bit more detail than I do for other texts or that I would do normally, because of how this is a first time through for most of you in this text, and it's a very challenging text to kind of keep up with, and it takes lots of twists and turns. And so, as a first major text that we're looking at, first lengthy kind of text, I wanted to make sure that we really kind of stay on a clear trajectory and following the key threads through. So I'm kind of trying to go through that in some detail here. So where we left off was that the central challenge of this text is being articulated. We saw that Thrasymachus, who was a sophist in Athens, was written in as a character who wanted to challenge Socrates in a number of different ways. He didn't like the fact that Socrates didn't answer for himself. He got other people to answer, and Socrates kind of questioned them. He didn't like how Socrates worked through this kind of question and answer interrogation. Instead, Thrasymachus wanted to make a speech, and he thought oratory rhetoric, that was the kind of main way, as it was for the sophists, to like kind of convince people. And he didn't like the kind of presumptions about justice that Socrates tended to make, and the commitments to justice that Socrates had. Thrasymachus thought that justice was something kind of weak. It was a sign of weakness, that when you follow justice, you're actually following the good of somebody else, the stronger person who can set the rules and who can impose that upon the weaker people. And so justice was something, they were a set of rules that were set to the advantage of the more powerful actors. And so it's actually not in your interest to be just. Now, sometimes you can be compelled to be just through the threat of punishment or what have you, and that maybe makes it in your own interest. But in the bigger picture, Thrasymachus thought justice is not in your own interest. And this, of course, flies in the face of kind of the central belief that Socrates has. He is deeply, deeply committed to justice and to convincing other people to care about justice, and that being moral, being good, being just is the primary way to nurture your soul, to have human happiness, to be to have kind of the intrinsic and instrumental rewards of this life and any afterlife. And um, so where we left off was Glaucon and Adeimantus kind of picking up Thrasymachus's challenge after Thrasymachus kind of pouts and bows out because he's not allowed to make a speech. And Glaucon and Adeimantus insist that Socrates has to defend justice in a better way. And so they are kind of re-articulating Thrasymachus's challenge in their own ways. And the first kind of way that Glaucon does this is by laying out the three types of goods that we were talking about last class. Things that are good in themselves, things that are good not in themselves, but for their consequences. And so you stomach them, They're not pleasurable in themselves, but you stomach them because they bring about good future consequences. And then there are things that are good in themselves and for their consequences. They are the most completely, fully good things. And so they ask Socrates, which is justice? And Socrates says, justice is, of course, the highest of goods, and therefore it must be both good in itself and for its consequences. And so that is the task ahead of Socrates to prove that justice is good in itself and for its consequences. However, in that challenge, the the real challenge is to show that justice is intrinsically good, that it is good in itself. Because what Glaucon and Adeimantus say to Socrates is that when people do defend justice, they almost always defend it for its its instrumental goods. So they defend it because it gives you a good reputation, or it makes the gods happy with you and they'll reward you later, or something like that, where it's not that justice is good in itself, but that it brings good things from it. And so they kind of say when people defend justice, they usually defend it instrumentally, not intrinsically. But what that would mean is that if you could have the good consequences of justice without the burden of actually having to be good, without actually having to be just, then you would kind of take that. You would, if you there were a way of having your cake and eating it too, having the good consequences of justice without the difficulties of having to be just, you would take that. But that would show again that justice isn't intrinsically good. It is only instrumentally good. And the way that they articulate this challenge, they put it in the form of a legend or a story. And that is the story of the Ring of Gyges. This is what they don't call it the story of the Ring of Gyges, but this is the story of that they tell um, uh, about this ancestor of Gyges, who was a shepherd, and they tell this story about what happens. Now, it's very interesting to flag at this point that this story may well sound kind of familiar to some of you. It's a story of a ring of invisibility that tests your moral strength. So some of you may be thinking, this sounds a lot like a kind of Lord of the Rings kind of story. And yes, Tolkien knew his Plato. And so we have here another story of a ring of invisibility that kind of can corrupt you and that tests your moral strength. And so the story here, leave aside some of the details, you've hopefully looked at this yourself, but the shepherd is kind of out in the field. There's a big earthquake. The shepherd kind of travels down into the chasm that has opened up in the earth. He finds a tomb of some kind and finds within this kind of tomb a ring. And he takes the ring and he puts it on, and he finds that if he turns the setting towards himself, he becomes invisible, and he turns the ring the other way, he becomes visible again. And so this allows this shepherd to do a bunch of things that include taking over this kingdom, like killing the king, stealing the king's wife, doing all this stuff by becoming invisible. and not but not being associated with his crimes. And so what is this story? Uh, what is the story testing for us or posing for us? It is testing again this key question: is justice good in itself? Is it valuable, worthwhile in itself? Because what the ring allows you to do is to maintain all the good reputation of being just. You don't have any negative consequences for being unjust. You can maintain a perfect reputation for being just, and yet you can do all kinds of unjust things and get away with it with complete impunity. And so you can have your cake and eat it too. So this is the test of whether justice is actually good in itself. If you had such a ring of invisibility that you could do whatever you wanted and get away with whatever you wanted, but maintain a perfect reputation for justice, wouldn't you do that? Wouldn't you use such a ring to do all kinds of unjust acts and get away with them? Put the other way around, would you have any reason to continue to be just, to be moral, to be good? Would you have any reason to continue to be good if you came into the possession of such a ring? Would you have a reason to continue to act morally if you had the option of doing the opposite with complete impunity? So, is there any reason to be just if you can do injustice with impunity? That's the big question that the story of the Ring of Gyges puts before Socrates here. And so, this is the gauntlet being thrown down. It is the big challenge before Socrates to have to defend justice as intrinsically good, even if its consequences were kind of bracketed off. That's the real difficult part of the challenge. And so this is the challenge that Socrates sets out to argue. Um, and so the search for justice now begins as we proceed through book 2. Now, what has to come first is that Socrates says, well, before we can ask what kind of good justice is, whether it's good in itself or its consequences for both, what have you, we have to know what justice is. We need to have some kind of definition or understanding of it in itself before we can ask why it's good. So the first task is to figure out what justice is. What's the definition of justice? And of course, the whole text started with a kind of discussion of different definitions of justice, with Polemarchus and Cephalus and Thrasymachus all offering different definitions of justice. So now the Socrates is searching for his own definition. But this is, of course, quite challenging. And so he kind of says, okay, well, what is it? And he says, this is going to be quite difficult. Maybe there's a way of pursuing this more easily, the definition of justice. Maybe there's a way of seeing justice more clearly, more easily, on a bigger scale, that then will allow us to understand justice within ourselves, within our souls. And so, what Socrates proposes, he says, okay, well, justice is a singular thing. Justice is one thing, whether it's in a city or it's in a soul and in an individual. Justice is a singular kind of trait. And so he says, okay, so let's find justice in a city. And it'll be on a larger scale. It won't be inside of us, which is kind of hard for us to look inward and see what's inside of us. In a city, it's a bigger scale. It's in the external world, and so we could see justice more easily in a city. So why don't we create a just city? And we'll figure out what justice is from there. And then we can turn back into ourselves, having been armed now with a definition of justice, a basic sense of what justice means. We'll then be able to turn back inside of ourselves and see what justice looks like for an individual person rather than a city. So, I should flag at this point, of course, that this is a course of political theory. It's not it's not a course first and foremost of moral philosophy. Um, and so our focus is on the politics of this text, the political theory of this text. And it's, of course, in the detour that Socrates is just about to make that the political theory of this text starts to emerge because Socrates says, let's create the perfect city. And remember, the city in ancient Greece here is the kind of main political unit. It is the kind of city state. The primary unit of politics is the city. And so when they're saying, let's create the perfect city, they are kind of talking about the central collective unit of politics. Like we often think about the country as the central collective unit of politics. They would think of it as the city. So there's a need here to find the definition of justice before being able to understand why or how it is good. And so as a result of that necessity, Socrates proposes a kind of magnification process that we find justice in a city rather than justice in a soul first, so that justice is on a magnified, larger scale, and then we can proceed back into the soul with a better sense of what justice is. So, Socrates and his friends say, okay, that's the task. We have the task now of trying to figure out what justice is in a city, what a perfectly just city looks like. So they say, okay, let's start to construct a city. And why does a city come to be? Why do human beings live in collective societies rather than just on their own? And so they say, okay, well, the reason for this, it seems, is that people are not self-sufficient. That really people have kind of particular skills or interests or talents, aptitudes, and they kind of, it's kind of works out best for it's very difficult for people to meet all their needs by themselves. In fact, they say that's kind of impossible. People are not self-sufficient in this way. So, where people come together in for smaller units of like families and then smaller villages, but even then, you see that the basic needs are um, uh, they're not like fully met until you get to a bigger kind of collective, to a kind of city, the scale of a city. That's when you kind of have all the needs of a human being, the basic needs and wants of a human being can be met collectively. You can have carpenters, and you can have cobblers, and you can have chefs, and you can have all kinds of different kind of uh, skills and talents together in a city, so that people's talents can all be used to contribute to the collective, and everyone does what they are kind of suited to, and they share with one another and they take from others what others are best suited to. And so this is, they say, where a city comes to be. It comes from the fact of that we're not self-sufficient on our own as individuals, and as a collective we become self-sufficient together as a unit. The self of the city is sufficient, not the self of the individual is sufficient on its own. So I say, okay, so that's kind of a basic, simple city where we've got all the basic needs met. We've got a cobbler, we've got a carpenter, we've got all these different tasks that are fulfilled, and you've and everyone's leading a simple life with their needs met, and they're kind of trading with one another according to everyone's particular skills. And we've got a nice little city here. Socrates kind of says, or actually, I think one of Glaucon or Adeimantus say to Socrates, well, wait a second. This doesn't sound like a very fun city. This doesn't sound like a very enriching city. It sounds actually, and we talked about this metaphor before. So in a previous class, we talked about the metaphor of like a pig contented, and this is where that metaphor comes back into this text. Either Glaucon or Adeimantus say to Socrates, well, hold on a second. Isn't this kind of like a city of pigs rather than a truly human city? And Socrates kind of like, what do you mean? What are you getting at? And they say, well, this is kind of there's no luxury. There's no delicacies. There's no there's no extra things. There's no extra wants or desires in this city. It's just kind of like your basic subsistence needs are being met, but there's nothing else beyond that. So it's kind of like a city for pigs, contented pigs. It's not really a human city. And of course, what's being implied in this kind of metaphor, this argument, is perhaps something about human nature. What they seem to be suggesting is that human beings are perhaps a bit different from animals in that they have they develop extra wants and desires. They have desires that go beyond basic subsistence. They want more than that. And it may even well be the case that it's precisely because human beings want more and they have desires that exceed, that go beyond their basic subsistence. That may well be the very source of injustice in us. The fact that we do not remain contented, that we desire more, that our desires are a bit unruly. They're a bit insatiable in a way, that we have to fight against our unruly, unsatiable desires. And so that may well be the source of injustice. And so it's kind of important for us to figure out, well, like what a just human city looks like. It's kind of important for us to imagine this not in an idealized way where human beings are kind of uh, removed from the desires they actually have that are actually the source of their injustice. But instead, so it's crucial for the full human picture to be part of a city, a just city, in order to know that it's really just, in order for it to be a truly just human city. So Socrates agrees with this. And Socrates kind of says to the others, okay, you're right. But he contends, he is very adamant, and this will come back, this will be important later on. So Socrates says very clearly, he says, okay, you're right. Let's give the city a fever. Let's make it a luxurious city. So let's give it a fever. Let's introduce illness, sickness, that specific human sickness of desire for unnecessary things. Let's introduce that into the picture. But, he says, I still contend that this simple city, the city that you call a city for pigs, he says, I still contend that this is in fact a just city. It has the hallmarks of justice, but maybe it'll be easier to see the justice of this city if we give it a fever, if we introduce luxury into this city. That'll maybe make justice more visible. Just like, you might think of the example of like somebody you know, or somebody you've met, or somebody you've heard about, who is a really, really good person, really moral person. But you also know that they've never been introduced to temptation. They've never been exposed to luxuries or particularly like intriguing kind of things that might push them to be more unjust. If you find a person like that, you might think, yeah, they're a good person, but you don't really know whether they're good because they're not really tested by its opposite. They're sheltered, they're unexposed. And so, in a way, Socrates and his friends here are saying, let's give the city a fever. Let's make it truly human. Let's give it the unnecessary temptations, and then let's see what justice looks like. It'll be more visible, it'll be more robust, it'll be something more clear and distinct. So yes, they say, okay, let's give the city a fever, let's give it luxuries, and let's create the luxurious city. And so they say, okay, well, if that's what we're doing, then of course, we're going to need a whole bunch of new occupations. We're going to need people who make delicacies. We're going to need people who do like art and poetry and all kinds of things that are like go beyond our basic needs, but that introduce beauty and aesthetic things and temptation of different kinds and things that are very tasty and delightful. So we'll need a whole bunch of new occupations, and that'll grow the size of the city. And the city will need more land, and the city will start to covet more and more land and space. And so the city will expand and it will start to look to conquer other territories. And so this is where they say war begins. So war only begins, of course, after luxuries have been introduced, the unnecessary desires have been put into this city. So they say, okay, well, we now will start getting into wars with our neighbors because we will want their land. We will need more people. We will want to conquer other peoples and lands and incorporate them into our own. And so you get these origins of war. And of course, war introduces a new occupation that's needed in the city. And that is a kind of set of soldiers, what they will call guardians. We need guardians for the city who will protect the city from external invasion and will be able to fight for the city as it expands and grows. Okay, so this is where the guardians enter the picture. Now, I flagged the guardians in particular because this is a very important class in the city, as it turns out. And they will end up spending a tremendous amount of time talking about these guardians of the city. And so at this point, the story kind of starts to take its first big tangent. Maybe it's not accurate to call it a tangent, but it takes its first kind of turn to a kind of new set of what seemed like a new set of topics. Because what happens is they start talking about the guardians. Okay, we need guardians in the city who will protect the city. But what they then start to talk about is, well, what kind of character are these guardians going to need to have? Moral character, like what kind of character and training will these guardians need to have? And therefore, what kind of education will they need to be provided with? And so they start a lengthy conversation at this point that starts to span the remainder of book 2 and through most of book 3, talking about the education of the guardians. And in really the focus here is on like, what kind of souls do we need them to have? What kind of moral education will the guardians need to have? These people who will be protecting the city from internal and external threats. What kind of people do these need to be? So in our terms, they're kind of discussing here the question of like what kind of people, character, and what kind of training and education is needed for the people who we entrust to protect our city and and who are going to be armed with tremendous lethal force. This is the question they're taking very seriously. So for us, it's the question of like, what kind of training and character do police officers and do military personnel need to have? And they are kind of from the get-go saying if guardians are going to be entrusted with lethal force and great power and strength and violence, they need to be shaped very carefully in terms of their character because that will determine whether they will actually protect the people or whether they will turn on the people and become like wolves to the sheep. There's this constant metaphor of like shepherds and sheep and like, and here the metaphor is of guard dogs, like shepherd dogs, like sheep dogs who protect the flock of sheep versus wolves who actually attack the sheep as prey. And so what they argue as they start to talk about the guardians and the kind of character they need, they say, well, and again, this is kind of where the very specific and idiosyncratic vocabulary of this text starts to emerge. Guardians and spirit. What they say here is that, okay, well, these guardians will need to be both spirited and philosophical. Spirited and philosophical. And they say, yeah, it's kind of like they're spirited in the sense that what they mean by spirit is kind of like another word that they'll start to use more regularly is like courage. They say they need to be courageous. They need to be willing to fight and defend the city. But they also need to be philosophical. They need to have knowledge. You say, well, what does that mean? And Socrates says, well, think about it. Think about like a good guard dog. A good guard dog is very courageous. It's willing to fight for its people that it's protecting. But it doesn't attack everyone, right? A guard dog knows who its friends are and who its enemies are. It knows who it's supposed to defend and who it's supposed to attack. So that is a form of knowledge. It's not just courage in itself, it's knowledge that differentiates where the virtue of courage is supposed to be exercised. So they say, yes, like a good guardian is both spirited, courageous, and philosophical. It knows how to differentiate who to protect and who to attack, who is to be feared, who is an enemy, and who is good, who is to be protected. And so they say this is the character that guardians need in order to be guard dogs rather than wolves. People who will guard the city and its inhabitants rather than wolves who will take the arms and training that they've been given in violence and turn it towards the people themselves who they are supposed to be protecting. This is the nature of the guardians. And so this is why the guardians need to have a very tight, very specific training and education so that they have a very specific character. In fact, like a very high character, that they are not going to become corrupted and set their sights on the people who they are supposed to be protecting. So this is where a long discussion ensues about the education of the guardians. So a particular kind of education is needed, and therefore let's have Socrates and his friends say, okay, well, let's then spend a while here talking about the specific kind of education they will have. And they end up in this winding, long conversation about what kinds of music will they be exposed to? What kind of stories will they be exposed to? What kinds of poetry will they be exposed to? What kinds of art will they be exposed to? All the things that they say we use to like teach children and that shape our souls. All of these things, music and poetry and stories and art, they all train us. They train our character. And so they're all part of our education. And so all of these we will need to think about in order to figure out how to make the guardians into good people. So I've entitled the next section here, which is through, again, books 2 and 3, Lies, Censorship, and the quote unquote moral education of the city. Because what happens through this section of the text is that Socrates and his friends end up designing an elaborate education system to shape, test, and train the moral character of individuals in the city. So, what starts out as a conversation about just the guardians ends up being a discussion, and this is like almost imperceptible, the slippage that happens here, but it quickly kind of becomes, it morphs into a discussion about the education system that the whole city is going to need to be subjected to. And in fact, this education system is going to be necessary in order to figure out who's going to be a guardian in the first place, who is going to be chosen to guard the city rather than to do the other tasks that the city needs done. So the education system becomes important not just for shaping the guardians, but for determining who's going to be a guardian and who won't in the first place. And what Socrates and his friends end up doing, and this is where a lot of people through the centuries who have read this text start to sometimes get a bit nervous in this part of the text or get a bit concerned in this part of the text, because what Socrates and his friends seem to start to develop here, and of course this is Plato's design going on here in this text, what Plato is trying to convince us of is the need for an extensive regime of control, supervision, and censorship of kind of everything and everyone in the city. What, in essence, what happens here is that it starts to become very clear that Plato is proposing for us a city in which the moral education, the moral fabric of the city is first and foremost, like that a good, just, perfect, ideal city would be one in which people are subjected to a very strict moral education and training that makes people, that crafts their souls and makes people as good as they could possibly be, morally good. So it's a deep form of moral education that comes through not just education in our sense of like, oh, what kind of classes are we going to teach them? But beyond that, a full regime of censorship in the whole city. Because it turns out what Socrates and his friends agree on here is that, in fact, everything in a city shapes our moral character. The architecture and design of a city shape moral character. that morality, moral goodness is infused through everything in human life. Every creation of human beings can be infused with goodness or badness, morality or immorality, justice or injustice. And so they say, okay, well, if we're going to have a truly good city and the children of the city are going to be exposed to only good things that make their character good, then we will need to censor and supervise everything that's created in the city. And so they say the music, the poetry, the craftspeople, the architects, the buildings themselves, everything needs to be censored and guided so that people will not be corrupted, morally corrupted. And furthermore, they suggest that the rulers of this city would actually need, the people supervising and guiding this city would actually need to use some myths or some lies to try to help, um, uh, again, guide people and to become more morally good and just. And so they even introduce through this discussion a lengthy conversation about lies in the city and how sometimes there are useful lies in the city, as we'll talk a little bit more about shortly. So there's going to be a full testing procedure and a censorship and supervision process of everything that is created in the city by all the different groups that are making things for the city. And ultimately, the education system, as I alluded to earlier, will kind of supervise children when they are young to figure out what their natural abilities are and what their natures are, and to figure out what class they should be put into in this city. So we start to see a certain class structure developing in this city where there are three different classes in this city that have to be populated. And the education system is what will kind of poke and prod and test the children to figure out what class they belong in. So over the course of these chapters, what emerges is that, and again, this isn't necessarily clearly explicitly stated, but it's a picture that emerges as the conversation kind of winds around. What emerges is a picture that all children initially are going to be part of this education system, and they'll be tested and it'll figure out what their aptitudes are. And as you figure out, okay, well, this person is suited to kind of this kind of work, they will, many people, most children will be removed from the education system and sent off to the task that they are suited to. So the lower classes, what they will call the producing class of the city, those will be the people who don't show the signs of great courage or what they call philosophy. They don't have the aptitudes of great strength and courage, and they don't have the philosophical aptitudes for the search for knowledge. If they are people who just like are better with like working with their hands and they're not necessarily very courageous and they're not philosophical, they will kind of be sent off to be part of the producing class of the city. But only those who show signs for courage, and philosophy. And in short, they think you can think of this as like those who show great signs of morality, moral virtues in different expressions of moral virtue. Only those who show signs of great moral virtue, they will be the ones who will continue through the education system. And ultimately, there will be, um, from this further education, two further classes that will be produced. There will be a ruling class that will consist of the most moral in the city, the people who show themselves to be absolutely incorruptible. They are filled with moral virtue. They always put the interests of the city and of the collective before their personal interest. Those people will be the ones who are best suited to rule and guide and supervise the city. So they will be the rulers, the most virtuous, the most incorruptible. They will be, in the metaphor Socrates, the and Plato more broadly uses in this text, is like they will be tested by fire. They will be kind of tempted by fire, and those who show themselves not to be burned, they are not corrupted by the temptations to put their own interests and pleasures ahead of the city. They will be the ones to become the rulers of the city. Those who show themselves to be quite moral, but not fully like philosophical, they don't have the highest aptitudes for understanding the reason behind why the reasons behind why you should be good and what the rational pursuit is here. Those people who show great signs of moral virtue and great courage and great strength of character, they will become a second class in the city, the class that they will call the auxiliary class, the soldier class. So now what they previously called the guardians is being divided into two different groups. What they call the true guardians or the rulers, and then the auxiliaries, the soldiers. And then thirdly, there will be the producing class, those who produce all the things that the city needs to survive and to thrive, all the wants and needs of the people in the city. So the guardian class, we're just due for a break, so I'll just stop here. The guardian class is split into complete guardians or true guardians and an auxiliary class, the soldier class. And yet these two kind of classes still seem to be together in one sense. They're given kind of different living arrangements from the producing class. They are to live separately from the producers. The producers kind of seem to live in private families. But the two guardian classes, the true guardians, the rulers, and the auxiliaries, they need to live in a different way. They need to live communally, where they don't have private possessions, they don't have private families, they live collectively in kind of common mess halls like army barracks. They live together where they are fed by the city. They are taken care of. Their basic needs are taken care of by the city and the producing classes. But they do not have any private goods or private families of their own because they cannot be corrupted by private interests. So the guardian classes will live separately, and the producers will live in their own, like, kind of more typical arrangements of private families and all. And so this is the picture of the city that emerges here. Okay, I'm going to pause here and we will uh, we'll come back to the story in just 10 minutes. I see that there's a question. Let me just say, let's take our 10 minutes and we'll come back and we'll start with some questions about the things that we've discussed here in the first half. Okay, so I'll start with questions and then we'll jump back into the story here. Okay, so John, I see your hand. We'll come back to it after the break. Okay, welcome back, folks, from break. Okay, so let's jump in here with and open it up to some questions that may have arisen from what we've talked about to this point. So, John, I think you had a question, or anybody else that wants to put their hand up and ask anything at this point? Yeah, go ahead, John.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I understood this correctly. Does this mean that Socrates was a communist?
Well, it doesn't uh, exactly. I mean, that's a bit too easy of a label. It's maybe too loaded of a label for this purposes because Socrates is or Plato here. Again, we need to attribute these arguments more to Plato because this is really Plato's own text written long after Socrates has died. And he's offering an argument that is quite kind of differentiated by class. Now, uh, the point of a communist society, in more our understanding of it, is to much in a more widespread way eliminate economic classes between uh, within society. But this is not that. This is a very highly differentiated hierarchical society in which the ruling class and the guardian class live a kind of communal lifestyle where they don't have private property and they don't have private families and they live all together and are provided for. But everyone else, the vast majority of people in the society, are part of the producing class who does not live in this communal way and who do have private property and who do amass wealth. But they are, in fact, less politically powerful, and politically and militarily powerful. They are less powerful in the hierarchy of the city than the people who um, don't have wealth, who don't have private property. So it's a very different story from what we understand by in like a modern ideology of communism. Leighton, you have a question.
Sorry, just fixing my microphone. Yeah, going off of John there, would it be fair to say that Socrates, less of a communist, but he's more of a moralistic monarchist, where he believes in like the systems of a highly educated court that controls the movings and shapings of the world, and then a lesser sort of more uh, producing society?
Yeah, I think that there's something like that label is maybe a bit more kind of captures a bit more of what Plato is getting at here, and it does capture a bit more of what Plato will describe going forward here, because he will as we will see shortly, he will talk about the rulers of the city as a group of kind of philosopher kings. So there is a kind of monarchical element of this society, and they are a monarchy of the most moral people in society. So that's what he means by the philosopher kings. They are the most knowledgeable and they are the most moral. They are the most rational of people in a society. And so, so yeah, something like moral monarchy is kind of close to what he will get at. Jordan.
Yes, hi, Professor. What about the paradox of having like a slave society? Like, weren't there slaves in ancient Greece? Like, what sort of implications did they place onto them, given that they're trying to determine different classes of people?
Yeah, it's an important question, and in this, what is interesting here is that slavery is fairly silent in this text, even though it was such a crucial part of Athenian society. There's this talk about the producing class, but there isn't a lot of mention, but there does seem to be in moments like a discussion of perhaps slavery being in the background of the text, that even with the producing class, there might still be, and he might be envisioning the role of slaves, but it's very it's very fleeting. Like we don't get a lot of sense. So it's hard to answer this question actually, but it's a very good question of how Plato saw the role of slavery, given that it was so important in Athenian society, whether he's really arguing for a society that eliminates that or whether it's still part of that. And we don't have uh, clear answers to that from this text, I don't think. Aaron.
I feel like that maybe for Plato, um, the idea that they would have slaves was maybe something he took for granted. So then like he didn't even like even include them in his um, um, just society city argument.
Yeah, in the framework. That's entirely possible. And there is some indication in parts of the text that maybe that's what he's doing, that he's so much taking it for granted that it's not even part of the argument, but it's still there. So that's totally plausible. But again, I don't think we have a very clear um like well-developed explanation or answer to this. John.
Yes. Um, Going off of the underprivileged in Athenian society, what would be the role of, like, say, foreigners? How would they be treated? How would women be treated?
Yeah. Great question. And it's something that we will touch on the question of his arguments around women um, in a bit, maybe not today, but in I think next class we'll talk a little bit about this. But let me just flag here that Plato presents a whole interesting set of arguments around women. And what he says is that, in fact, talents are distributed among women in the same way that they're distributed among men. Now, he still maintains a bit of a pejorative thing there. He says, they're just like there's kind of like lesser amounts, but the talents are distributed in a roughly similar kind of distribution. So some women have the talents of like philosophy and courage and other virtues, and some are more suited to producing. And so what Plato ends up arguing is that women actually should belong to all three of the classes, that there will be women producers, women auxiliaries, women rulers. And so women are going to be spread out throughout the city. The question of foreigners is an interesting one because, of course, yes, you're right. Athenians made they didn't even grant kind of citizenship to foreigners, people, unless you're born into Athens, you could never become a kind of citizen of Athens. So somebody like Aristotle, who ends up moving to Athens, being Plato's student, who we'll look at briefly after Plato, Aristotle never became a citizen of Athens because he wasn't born there. And so the question of foreigners in this city is again, it's not one that's given a lot of central focus. And so we don't really know exactly how Plato takes it in the ideal city. We can talk about it in terms of Athenian society historically that Plato lived in, but Plato had a lot of problems with Athenian society. He was a great critic of Athenian society, including, as we will see a little bit down the road here, of Athens's great contribution to world history, that many people consider, which is Athenian democracy. Plato was one of the great critics of Athenian democracy. He did not believe in Athenian democracy. And so Plato is critical of lots of aspects of Athens, and so we don't really know exactly how he thinks about the practice of exclusion of foreigners in Athens versus this ideal city, because he doesn't say a lot about it when in the construction of the ideal city in this text, but it's a great question. Okay, so let me now go back to the PowerPoint and come back to the thread of the text that we're pulling on here in book as we kind of work our way through book 3. Okay, so we've talked about the fact that they're setting up this education system. It turns out to be an education system for the whole city that helps to create the class system of the city, where people are kind of screened and tested for their natural strengths and their aptitudes to figure out what class they should belong in. And then the producing class, the people suited to be producers, will be kind of shunted out of the education system earlier on, and the people who have the most kind of moral aptitudes and virtues, they will kind of continue on and either become auxiliaries, soldiers of the city, guardians of the city, or rulers of the city if they are the most rational and the most virtuous and the ones suited to lead, they will become rulers. So they will complete the most education. In fact, they will be educated until they're about. Plato speculates at one point in the text and says they'll need to be trained and educated until they're like 50 years old, and only then will they be kind of given the actual role of ruling. But at a certain point later in book 3, they have to confront this question of, well, hold on, Glaucon, Adeimantus kind of say, how will we get people to agree to this system? Why would they accept this system? How would we get them to accept it? And so at a certain point, they have to kind of confront this question late in book 3. And at this point, they say, well, they would get the people of the city to accept this arrangement, this whole system, through a great lie, a great myth that the people of the city will be told. And so this section raises this whole question about lies, political lies in the interest of the city, which is, of course, a perennial big question in politics. Like, at what point are rulers and leaders, to what extent are they allowed to lie to the people to protect the best interests of the city? And of course, that introduces a secondary question of like, what about the threat of them lying to the people and lying to the city out of their own personal interest? Like, what's the line between those two? When are lies acceptable? And how do we kind of differentiate between lies that are in the public interest and lies that are in the private interest of the rulers who are telling them? So the question of lies becomes a big question in book 3 of the text. And now I'm backtracking a little bit because they've discussed this earlier in book 2 and 3. They kind of talk about the question of lies. And they suggest in this discussion that there are two kinds of stories that the children are told in this city. They call them true and false stories, but really in our kind of vocabulary around this, what they're getting at is fictional and non-fictional stories, true and false. Like, so true stories are non-fiction. They're stories of things that actually happened. And false stories are fictional stories. They're conjured up, they're made up. And so they kind of, in this discussion of like what kinds of stories to allow the children to hear in the city, they say, okay, well, aren't there true and false stories? Aren't there non-fictional and fictional stories that children are told? And we think that that's fine. And they say, yeah, that's true. And so that means that there's two kinds, and then there's two kinds of falsehoods or types of lies that we can differentiate. There are what Socrates calls a lie in words versus a lie in the soul. And what he argues is that sometimes lies that are told, fictional stories, falsehoods that are told to children or to others because they have a good lesson. The lesson that they teach is true, even if the story itself is not true. Those kinds of stories that contain a great moral truth and they teach a good lesson, but they're not strictly speaking true. They're not non-fictional. They are fictional stories. They're not true, but they teach a true lesson. They are what Socrates calls a lie merely in words. They are a lie in words, but they're not a true lie because they contain a great truth. So it's a lie merely in words. But there's another kind of lie that would not be allowed in the city. And these are the things they're trying to prevent. They're trying to censor out of the city. These are what they call a lie in the soul. That is a lie, a falsehood that actually doesn't teach a good lesson to the soul, but actually corrupts the soul. It implants a falsehood into the soul. That is a lie in the soul. A lie in the soul is never acceptable in the city. Those will never be allowed to be told in the city. But lies in words, the rulers will be allowed to tell the people in the city. Again, false stories, fictional stories, myths, legends that tell a good, teach a good moral lesson. Those lies in words will be allowed in the city by the rulers. And they are what Socrates and his friends call useful lies. They're kind of like a medicine or a drug of some kind. This is the metaphor they use. It's like a medicine that the rulers will administer to the people, which teach the people a good lesson. They're useful, but they are nonetheless lies. And so at the end of book 3, they come back to this discussion of that they've already had earlier on about useful lies and the fact that sometimes the rulers will use useful lies as a kind of drug to produce a healthy people, to produce a healthy city. And so at the end of, close to the end of book 3, when they are confronting this question of how will we get people to accept this system that we've created, they say, oh, actually, now is a perfect time for one of those great lies, those useful lies that we said they would be allowed in the city and that the rulers would use to help the city become healthy. And so they say, yes, we will tell a great lie, a great myth to the people of the city that will help them to accept the system that we've created, because they're not going to be smart enough. They're not going to have the rational aptitudes to really understand the reason behind the system, the necessity of the class-based system, the education system. They're not going to understand the reasons behind it. So they'll be told a myth that will help them to accept the system in all of its wisdom, but a wisdom that they don't fully understand. So the myth that they develop here at the end of book 3, scholars of Plato often refer to this as the myth of the metals or the noble lie. It's often referred to in either way. And so what is this noble lie that they devise to tell the city? And they specify in particular, this will be especially for the producing class, but it may even be used for the auxiliaries as well. Only the rulers will know the truth because they're devising and enforcing the system, but the producers and the auxiliaries will need a little bit more to help them accept the system. So what they will be told is this: the big lie that the city will be founded on will be a myth that says all of this education system, all of the children of the city, when they are born, they are kind of incubated inside of the earth, and their education system is like a dream. Their childhood they experience as kind of like a dream that they experience while they're being incubated inside the earth. The earth is like their mother, and they are being nurtured and raised up inside of the earth as they are being educated as young children and trained as young children. And so they are all kind of living in this kind of dreamlike state where they're experiencing the world as they're being educated, but all of that is kind of like a dream while they're in this kind of incubation process inside of the earth. And what the education system is kind of doing is figuring out what metal each child has mixed into their soul. So they are told that every child, every person has a metal that the gods have mixed into their soul. The gods have mixed either gold, silver, or bronze/iron into the souls of every person in the city. And what's happening in the education process is that the soul, the metal, is being kind of determined of each child in the city. And so the according to the metal that each person has in their soul, they will be put into a particular class of the city. The bronze and iron people will be the producing class. The silver class, the people with silver mixed into their soul, they will become auxiliaries, the soldier class. And the people with gold mixed into their soul, they will become the rulers of the city. That's what everyone will be told. That the gods have given them a particular metal, and that according to that metal, that's why you've been placed in the class that you have. And so what this myth does is it helps people to accept that there will be a strict social hierarchy of three classes in the city, and that that hierarchy has been given by the gods. So again, this is a myth that kind of uses divine intervention as a basis for gaining social acceptance of hierarchy here. So the people will be told the gods have given you your class by giving you a particular metal in your soul. But they also make it clear that, in fact, the metal that you have is not predetermined by the people that you were born from. In fact, anyone could be born from any particular kind of parents to any other class. So every individual has to be evaluated individually, because you can't read off of anybody's class from who their parents were. So there is a sense of like individual class mobility, that you will be able to end up in any particular class. That is predetermined by the gods, but it's not predetermined by your lineage. And in fact, in the city, it appears that people won't even know their lineage. It seems that the children will be kind of raised collectively from birth to be by the city rather than by private families. So there's a kind of murkiness about all of this, but it seems that children will be raised collectively until it's determined whether they should be producers, and then they will be sent off to live in producing families. But it's not clear if they will go to the families that actually birthed them in some way, or parented them, or what have you. This isn't clear in Plato's telling, but they will nonetheless be told that the gods have created the three classes of the city. They've created this hierarchy, but every individual will need to be evaluated to figure out what class they are in. And so this story, this myth, the myth of the metals, the noble lie that is told to the city, it is used to reinforce both unity and division in the city. On the one hand, the people learn from this myth that they are all kind of brothers and sisters of the earth. They are all they have a common mother. They are all born from the earth, and they are also like products of the gods who have determined who have given them this gift of the metal in their souls. And so that second part, it gets them to accept division or hierarchy. So on one hand, the earth is their mother. They have a loyalty to this city, to the earth that they were born into. They will protect it. They will put it first, excuse me. They owe everything to their mother, to this city that has birthed them. So they are all brothers and sisters to one another. So there's a unity there, but there's also division and hierarchy in the sense that the gods have given them different tasks and different roles and different classes to live in. So the myth tells a story of both unity and division and gets people to accept both the loyalty to the city, the patriotism, in our word, of the city, this like undying loyalty to the city, but also it gets them to accept that they will have a different task than others, and that some will rule over them, some will rule and some will be ruled. So this is the noble lie that they propose telling the people, that the rulers will tell the people to get them to accept the city. And so this raises not only the question of lies and politically useful lies in the interest of the city, but it also raises the question of like grand myths. All different societies usually have some kind of myth that is not strictly true, that tells a story about the nation, about the people, that is like a glorified version of the origins of the city or of the people. That is not actually true. Every country has kind of myths that it tells itself. And Canada, of course, is no exception to this. And so what's being raised here for us is the question of the myths that every society tells itself and that holds the society together in some ways. And so it's not, if we think about it that way, it's not so fantastical as when we're reading this text and we think, oh, this is kind of pie in the sky nonsense, like that they'll have this myth that everyone will believe. But of course, every society, practically, if not all society, has myths that it has told itself, falsehoods that it tells itself, that has some kind of effect on unifying the city or the nation, and that is told over and over again, and that lives in the minds of the people as a result. So this is the one for the perfect city, the ideal city that Socrates and his friends are constructing here. Now, the last part of book 3 that I want to kind of, and it comes right at the end of book 3, is this question of the living arrangements of the guardians that I've already alluded to, and I just want to come back to this. And just make sure we kind of delineate what Plato argues here. What he says is that these two guardian classes, the auxiliaries, the producers, they will have these separate living arrangements. They will have no property. no wealth, no luxuries. They also will have no private families, including spouses and children. They will have arranged mating. So the sexual relations will be entirely arranged for them by the rulers, and their children will be reared in common. Now, it seems like the children of the whole city will be reared in common, so that part is a bit murky, as I said. Plato doesn't clarify this really clearly, but nonetheless, the guardian classes will continue to live communally without any private families, even beyond childhood. And they will live communally. Instead of living in private households, they will live in mess halls, army barracks, like kind of communal kind of halls where they will live together and dine together and sleep together, and they will just kind of have this kind of communal existence. So the question is why? And what Plato again seems to be getting at is that this, and he says kind of quite explicitly, that these living arrangements will be an extension of the education of the guardians. So it will be an ongoing part of their education in the sense that they will learn through and they will continue to uphold through this separate living system to put the city first. In other words, they will not be allowed to develop private interests. The Plato's getting at here is that private property, private wealth, having children and families that you are looking out for individually, those create private interests that tend to be the main sources of corruption. That people, once they have private interests, they will put those private interests ahead of the public interest, and they will become corrupted. They will do things for themselves rather than for the city. And so what Plato is doing here is saying we will eliminate the sources of private interest and of therefore of corruption for these guardian classes because it's crucial that they not become corrupted more than others because they are the ones given political power and physical, like lethal power. They are granted physical and military power, and so they cannot become corrupted. So all of this is meant to ensure that the guardians are, and they come back to this metaphor of guard dogs. They need to be dogs who protect the sheep rather than wolves who prey on the people. So that's the purpose for these living arrangements. Sorry. So that's, and again, this is spoken of very quickly. It's not something that Plato goes into great depth on here, but it is just kind of quickly referred to in some way. And then they come back to it a little bit. There is some discussion through some of book 4 and 5 on these questions, including the question of women. They especially come back to it to discuss women in, I think, book 5. But nonetheless, it's a fairly quick discussion. We don't get it in great detail, but you get the main kind of idea here. Yes, Leighton, you have a question?
Sorry, just to clarify, who exactly are the sheep? Are the producer class, are they the sheep? Is the whole collective society the sheep?
Yeah.
Who are the
Yeah.
guardians protecting in
Good
regards to the
question.
sheep?
I think, yes, the easiest way to understand this, I think, is that the producing classes are the sheep. the auxiliaries are kind of these guard dogs who protect the flocks. And then you can think of the ruling class as kind of like the shepherds. They are the human who leads the whole flock and kind of makes decisions for the whole flock, and who the guard dogs themselves follow. So I think that's kind of probably the easiest way to understand the metaphor that they're using here. John, yes, you have a question?
Yes. With the producers allowed to amass private property, what is there to stop the development of a corrupt merchant class?
Yes. Well, very good question. And the uh, the answer essentially that we can derive from what Plato is saying is the fact that there will be the two higher classes that have political and military power that will keep the producing class in check. They will strictly govern and rule over them to and will make sure that a such a kind of a kind of overly powerful merchant class will not develop. So again, we don't have a lot of can't say this really in detail but like that's the basic picture is that they will be ruled over very, very carefully by and very strictly by the two ruling classes, or the rulers and the auxiliaries who do their bidding. So the shepherd, the guard dogs will really monitor and very strictly rule over the sheep. So um, I mean, that might not be a satisfying answer to your good question, but that's kind of the answer that Plato is essentially giving us here. Now, just I want to kind of take stock of a few things here, and that is the big questions that books 2 and 3 raise. And then I'll have to wrap up. I'm out of time, and I continue to be quite behind here, but nonetheless, we'll catch up eventually. So I want to just flag for us the big questions that books 2 and 3 raises for us. And there's a few questions here that I just want to put before us, not necessarily to discuss, but just to think about, because the text is raising these questions for us, either intentionally or maybe even unintentionally. The text puts these questions before us. One is, should those entrusted to protect society with power and arms be the most moral among us? If so, how should that be achieved? So there's a real question here. Plato takes really seriously that when you give political and military power to certain people in a society, that means you have to make sure that they will be the least corruptible people. And so, how do you do that? How do you make sure that the people who have the most power are actually the most moral in society? That is a big question that we don't necessarily take that seriously in our society. We kind of think about political power and military power as like kind of there are certain jobs among others. They don't necessarily like pay some lip service to like people with political and military power being like very honorable or they need to be, but like really most of the time we don't strictly enforce that in some way. We kind of think of them as kind of having certain jobs that other people don't have, and that there are some jobs among others. But Plato takes this very, very seriously. Those who are entrusted with power need to be the least corruptible. They need to be the most moral in society. So again, this raises questions about the relationship between morality and politics that is our big thematic focus for this half of the course. A second question is it legitimate for governments to tell lies and myths to their citizens for the public interest, for the good of the city? What role do foundational myths play in various societies? So again, it's a question that I flagged earlier. The third question that this section of the text raises for us, is it the role of political institutions to shape, instill, and enforce moral character? How far can or should politics, that is, the laws or the education system, how far should they go in shaping people's moral character? This is a big debate in our society that happens a lot, where sometimes we say, "Oh yeah, the state needs to have a role in teaching certain values and enforcing certain public values and goods and norms." And then at other times, there are debates where people say, no, the society should just teach people to pursue their own good, and that families or parents or what have you should be in charge of teaching the moral education and the religion and other things of children, and that the state should stay out of that. So there are big questions again about the relationship between morality and religion and politics that are raised here. What role should political institutions play in shaping people's moral and religious kind of character? And finally, here, there are big questions that are raised by this text, and this is maybe more unintentionally. The text raises for us questions about what are the many risks and dangers that are associated with projects, of social engineering. So when you try to engineer a society and you're trying to engineer the very souls and characters of people in a society, that tends to raise some warning flags for us, that like social engineering projects have gone astray in many different times and places. It is an impulse that lots of rulers and leaders and societies have had, but they often are quite perilous in their outcomes. And so, what dangers are there in trying to engineer whole societies in accordance with certain kinds of outcomes, desired outcomes? And who gets to decide what those desired outcomes are and the project to which the people will be engineered? Like, who gets to have a say in that? Does everyone get to have a say? Only the best among us, should they be the ones having a say in terms of like the big picture questions, goals of society? These are again the big questions that this section of the text tends to raise for us, and that scholars and readers of this text have debated over centuries that come out of this section of the text. Okay, so we'll leave it there for today, and we will come back to book 4 for next class. Books 4 and 5 we will come back to for Thursday's class. I see, if folks need to go, that's fine. I'll continue recording, just taking this last question here, and you can come back and watch it or what have you, but I'll keep recording, but I'll just take this one question. Adam, yes.
Hey, Professor. I just emailed you about I'm in the Canadian Armed Forces, and I just sent an email about me having to do a training exercise, and I was just trying to follow up with that.
Okay, sure. Sorry. So this isn't a question that others will need to be a part of.
No.
I'll stop the recording here and then address that briefly. So let me just do that. 1 second.